things that come into play, and litigation is one of those things. And so one of the friends that reached out to me today is an attorney, and he is a pilot, and he has done litigation in the past. So there's a law firm that's already representing half of the passenger families from the American Airlines aircraft that have reached out to him asking if he wants to be part of the litigation team. Um, and then, heard from some other friends who are commercial pilots, and then I've got another friend who's a private pilot, and I think everybody just wants to understand as much as they possibly can, and I think there are a lot of questions that all kind of go back to how could this possibly happen, and if you saw some of the back and forth that I got into last night, probably not all of it because I was up till 4 in the morning fighting with some of these clowns, but the whole thing of calling it intentional. I mean, for that to be true, and this is why I came out so strongly against that. For that to be true, not only do you have to be suicidal, but your other two crew members in that Blackhawk have got to be suicidal, or assume that the two pilots of the airliner are suicidal, and they're going to start ramming aircraft. And while I get that we've been through a lot in the last 4 years, and the government's not to be trusted, and all of the conspiracies that we've been monitoring came true. I get all that, but at the end of the day, not everything is conspiracy, and it just so happens that this is one area that I've got a lot of experience in, and I see that Jay just popped on here, who Jay's got actual experience with a Black Hawk. I flew a different type of Army aircraft, but my last assignment in the Army was on the GO team, and this is the kind of accident investigation that I would be called out to go and investigate. Now, this one obviously will be conducted jointly between the NTSB and the FAA. They've already announced that. They haven't announced the Army's involvement, but because they're a stakeholder in this, they most likely will have a seat at the table, and if nothing else, they will certainly conduct their own internal investigation. So, um, focusing on the how could something like this possibly happen, and you know, because that seems so far fetched that people defaulted to this had to have been intentional um, reaction. It's just not well thought out, and again, like I said, once you've seen enough of these type of events and accidents occur, you start to recognize the markers. All the markers were there, and were visible if you know what you're looking for. And we have a few ways that we talk about. We talk about the accident, chain of causation, where it's like links in the chain. When I talk to my pilots, I actually manage a portfolio of safety programs for different companies out there, and when I'm talking to my pilots, one of the things that we do is we identify anomalies. So that was one of my big takeaways uh, while I was an accident investigator, was just going through the process. You gather as much information as you possibly can. You try to keep the speculation as to what happened to a minimum. But one of the things that I think people don't realize is that before the Army ever launches their investigation team, the very first question they answer is, was this an accident or was this intentional? And the reason that they make that distinction right out of the gate is because if it's intentional, it's a criminal act. And then during Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns, there was a third, and that was, is it a shoot down? And if it was a shoot down, then they had another type of team that would go out and they would do the investigation to gather tactical information on it. But I was with the Army Safety Center, and if we launched, it was an accident. It had already been determined that there were enough markers there that we could say that, this was not the intended outcome of the event, and there's no indication that there were any bad actors contributing to this. And that's another thing that I've said to folks today about intentionality and, how do you separate this from a conspiracy, is because there's nothing that supports that this was an intentional act. I mean, we don't have any nations, claiming responsibility. We don't have any type of things that we, wouldn't expect to be present in a midair collision like this coming into play. At least not yet. It had not come to light, and I think as we saw Secretary Hegseth brief us, he is saying, this was something we're going to get to the bottom of, and we're going to make sure it never happens again. Coming from the Secretary of Defense, if this was a hostile act against our country, his response would have been, very different than that. So when you hear things being said, whether it's the president or the Secretary of Defense saying, we're going to get to the bottom of this, we're going to get the answers, and we're going to make sure it never happens again. That's all investigative speak. That means we don't have all the answers. We're going to get to the bottom of it. So thanks to those of you popped in. Jay, or any of you others who, if you want to speak, just send me the request and I'll get you approved so you can contribute to the discussion. I'm just kind of filling time while John opens up the invitation to more folks. So.
Okay, I'll add something. So I have a buddy of mine that sells helicopter, like actual helicopters to all the privates. I guess he does some military contracts as well too. Hold on, let me know it. And he I mean his text message last night. He said it was definitely okay. Actually, let me just read it because I can't remember. Because I said, how the hell does a helicopter like have the speed to fly into a plane? You know what I mean? Because every helicopter that I've been on, there's a lot of First of all, there's a ton of visibility on a helicopter, right? Especially, right. And I do know from my buddies that are pilots that flying at night is easier than flying during the day, right? So he said, oh, they probably had it on autopilot and pilot failure of situational awareness. And then I was like, oh crap, whatever. He goes, because this was way before. He's like, it could have been a Cessna that they crashed into, because it was way before anybody knew what was going on. And he says the stall speed of a Cessna when they're coming into land is about 55 miles an hour. The helicopter doesn't have to pull back until he gets damn near the landing spot. So I don't know what that means. Blah blah blah. But he did say, he's like, it's just situational awareness, complete absent miscommunication, maybe between the tower and another aircraft. Who the hell knows? But I guarantee you, the NTSB is all over it like stink on poop. I had to clean that up.
Yeah. So there's some good points in that, and let me decipher a little bit of it. So now that we know it's a CRJ and not a Cessna, the approach speed's much higher. Let's just say it's 120 knots for the sake of argument. I don't know. I'm not a CRJ pilot, but they do have to be configured, and they have to be in what's called a stabilized approach, and that means they've got the flaps down, they're aligned with runway, they've got the correct approach angle, which is around 3 degrees. One of the things that, and I'll just pop this in real quick. One of the things that I would do is photographic analysis, and I kind of am self-taught with regard to Photoshop, but there are a lot of cool things that you can use with regard to distances and things like that to help you get some additional information that is not something that you would be able to really get otherwise. But I looked at the impact point. I went to Google Earth, They've got the measurement feature. I pulled it out. So the crash happened about roughly 3,000 feet off the approach end of runway 33, which is the runway that the jet was cleared to land. And if you look at, if you look at the last transmission points from the aircraft, you can kind of come up with a spot of where they collided, and that is directly in line with the runway. So that tells me that the CRJ, the American Airlines aircraft, it was lined up for landing. It was configured for landing, and that means gear down, flaps down. And then I got this from a jet pilot today. He said he flies Gulfstreams, but he has got some commercial experience. He said, when you're configured for landing, he goes, those aircraft tend to sit back a little bit. And what he's saying is, you got a ton of dashboard in front of you, which is different from a helicopter where you do have better visibility. But what you're looking at your intended landing point at the end of the runway. And to be perfectly honest with you, you're really not doing an active scan for traffic at that point. If you go back, you listen to the tapes, I've listened to it a couple times. They weren't calling out traffic advisories to the American Airlines aircraft. They were calling out the traffic advisories to the Blackhawk and giving them instructions to pass behind, which they acknowledged. So what he means by a helicopter, you don't have to pull back. You can fly in at whatever your airspeed is, 90, 100 knots, until you get really close to your landing point, and then you can just kind of pull it back into a decelerative attitude. You can stop because an aircraft can fly 0 knots and pretty much stop quickly. So that's what your friend's talking about there when he says you don't have to slow down with a helicopter. But 100 knots for the helicopter, 120 knots for the jet. I mean, they're moving at a pretty fast clip. But here's something that was revelatory to me that my buddy, the jet pilot, said, is that it appeared when those instructions were called out from tower for PAT 25 to acknowledge that they had the American Airlines aircraft in sight. One thing is you can't hear them acknowledge on the tape, and the reason for that is he said that when DCA Reagan, when they broadcast from tower, they broadcast on 2 frequencies simultaneously. One is for the fixed wing, the fast movers, and then the other is for helicopters. So when they speak, they're speaking on 2 radio frequencies. The helicopter is responding on an independent frequency from the one that the jets are on. And I think they do that because helicopters are vectored in and around differently than the jets are. They follow a very regimented pattern as opposed to the helicopters that can maneuver through these low-level routes. So at the end of the day, the helicopter did acknowledge that they had the traffic, and they were told that the follow-up communication from tower was to go behind that aircraft. And so here's what my friend said to me that made a lot of sense. He said, as they were approaching one another, it looked like they thought they were going to do rules of the road and each pass out the right side of the other, without realizing where they were in relationship, the helicopter realizing where they were in relationship to the approach end of runway 33, or maybe they just missed that traffic was landing 33 altogether because what was happening, as you listen to the tape, the tower is landing aircraft on runway 1 and runway 33, and they're overlapping them, and they're launching from runway 1 and they're landing runway 33. And so if you look at the track that was the flight tracks that was released from, somebody got a hold of it from an air traffic controller station, and they posted it online, that tells a big story. And what you see is as the jet is coming down the river, kind of opposite direction, if you think of the river as a 2-lane road, they're coming down, the far side of the bank, and the helicopter's more in the middle of the river. But then what happens is the jet has to turn on to final approach. And as he does that, and you watch this track, it turns in the way a bowling ball, that's got spin on it, will come from the outside of the lane and then at the last minute track in and hit that kingpin. And to me, that's a really close analogy to exactly what these flight patterns that we saw last night were, is that the jet was making his turn to final. And I don't think the guys in the helicopter realized that they were right in the middle of the approach path to runway 33. And so I think that that's what the investigation will focus on, is to try to determine exactly where they were and what was going on. So we got a lot more folks here. Let me pause for a minute and give some of the speakers a chance to contribute.
Let me just interrupt here. In the bubble, I just posted a post that my buddy, he put the actual flight tracks, and if you look at it in the bubble, you'll see that map. And the blue, he was explaining to me that those are the official tracks that helicopter routes use. So I guess they have like routes that helicopters have to take. I don't know how this stuff works, buddy. I just
Yeah. No, you're right.
But
you're right.
And if you see it, you'll see it right there. The thing is, I think like you probably veered off a little bit off the track. I don't know, but take a look at it.
Yeah. So they do the same thing around New York, and one of the companies that I work with on a weekly basis, we fly in and out of New York all the time, and they do have, they're called low level routes, and some of them are instrument routes, and then some of them are visual routes, meaning you're not on autopilot, you're hand flying the aircraft, whether it's helicopter or airplane. So both of these aircraft were flying visually, and I think that's another thing that gives people a lot of heartburn over how this could possibly happen, because they weren't flying instruments, they were approaching visually at that point in time. And just real quick, the whole point of flying instruments in the first place is to get you to a point at the end of that instrument approach where you can visually make out the airfield environment, and then you can hand fly and proceed visually. So if you look at whatever, it was a Ring camera or whatever the camera was that we've all looked at that shows the collision, it was a pretty clear night. It doesn't appear to be hazy. There aren't big halos around the lights. It's pretty crisp. So it was a clear night. The Blackhawk had goggles. Now whether they were using the goggles or not at that point in time, we don't know. But this much I do know, is that I've investigated accidents like this in the past, and there was one just last year where there was there's a Bell 407, which is kind of your typical news helicopter size, hit a sky crane in California. And I believe the crash actually happened the end of 23, but I was looking into it last year for the two companies that were actually involved. It was one of each of their aircraft. And it was the same kind of thing. People said, how in the world can you hit a sky crane? A sky crane is a huge helicopter that they use for firefighting, and they use for heavy lift construction. The Army doesn't have them anymore, but a lot of the civilian companies have picked them up, and they're using them for utility work and special firefighting missions. And so how in the world does that happen where you have one helicopter flying to a sky crane, which is essentially the biggest helicopter you're going to encounter in the American skies, and then that's the part of investigation, is you start looking for and identifying all of those answers, and then putting together to find out the story of what actually happened. And in that instance, the two helicopters were flying too low. They were masking one with terrain, meaning that there was like a hilltop in between the two of them, and then they just so happened to pick the same ridge line to cross at the same time. One was flying, the sky crane was flying down the ridge line. The little news helicopter popped up, and they were just right there. They surprised each other, and it's too late. And the collision occurred, and the sky crane, everybody survived, and the smaller helicopter, everybody perished. And it's that same how could this possibly happen question that everybody wants the answers to. But then when you realize that, there was a focal point that both of those aircraft had, and that was the fire. One was going to, drop a load of fire retardant on it. The other one was actually the command and control aircraft. The smaller one was a command and control aircraft. But they were both, we suspect, focused on the fire because that's your next intended point of arrival. And so it could have been a similar situation like that last night, where, and again, this is something that we talked about early on in this call. The it's possible. I can't say for certain because I don't know, but it's possible that the training flight last night was a local area orientation. We call them LAOs, and you would conduct an LAO with a new pilot and crew to show them the area. So you would first go out and you would do local area orientation during the day. You point out all the check marks, the routes, and landmarks and routes, and let them interact and hear the interaction with the local air traffic controllers, and interact with the other traffic in the airspace. Because, like you said, how does it work with these helicopters and jets and crowded airspace? And the answer to that is they have these low level routes for the helicopters to fly. And if you've got a new pilot coming into your unit, you don't just turn them loose. You take them out and you show them the ropes, so to speak, during the day, and then you're going to do it again at night because that's the Army mission. We fly day and night, and it's a completely different skill set, if you will, operating at night than it is during the day. And there's reasons for that that go beyond, just your visual acuity, but also when you incorporate the use of night vision goggles, then you have a very limited field of view. It narrows it down considerably. And so if the mission, and again, this is a big if, was for the helicopter to conduct a local area orientation, as they were transiting along the Potomac there and passing adjacent to DCA, it is possible, if not likely, that the instructor pilot was directing the attention of the incoming pilot to the airport and pointing out things along the way, and they just did not pick up on the fact that the jet was going to make its turn to final, and that they were right in the middle of the final approach path. And so, again, just a theory. This kind of works, when you're doing accident investigation, like an episode of House, where you start out with a theory, and then, as you collect the information, when the information tells you something different, you change course and you adjust, and you go where the information leads you. And at the end of the day, when it is all said and done, like I said, the Army will have an investigation completed. Though, given the scope and the impact of this, it'll take anywhere from a month to 2 months, and then that report will be held internally for Army use. It won't be shared with the public because they never are. But those investigations are geared towards ensuring that this never happens again. So the Army will come up with its own internal set of rules and requirements that they'll put in place to make sure this doesn't happen again. And then the NTSB will they will issue an initial report, which is pretty much factual. It says, here's what we know: this occurred, this occurred, this occurred. And it'll have some background information that says, both aircraft were, mechanically sound. The crew were not found to be under the influence of any substances and things. They'll have all that.
If anybody has questions, but I just heard on the news that one of the pilots had 1,000 hours. I don't know if that's a lot or not. And then the other pilot had 500 hours. And of course, one's a female that has 500 and one's a male. I mean, I don't care about any of that stuff, but I don't know if 1,000 is a lot of
Which
hours for a pilot.
which aircraft was that? Was that the?
That's the Blackhawk.
Hmm. That's interesting because so 1,000 hours you're climbing into the mid range experience level. 500 is kind of that you're not inexperienced, but you're still, you don't know everything you don't know yet at 500 hours, and so that would be to be perfectly honest with you, that kind of surprises me. That sounds like a little low for a VIP unit like this, but not necessarily. Jay, have you got any questions or anything you want to contribute? I appreciate you joining us, and I know that you know that Blackhawk like the back of your hand, and would be interested to hear who you've talked to and what you've heard today that may have shaped your opinion.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Sorry, I'm driving to work, so hopefully it's not too loud. But your assessment is pretty spot on. It looks like loss of situational awareness. One of the things that people were asking me about is the VIP configuration of the bellboard birds. The crew chief is he's highly restricted in what he can see. So him being able to assist the pilots in avoiding the plane or whatever is kind of limited in that airplane, or that helicopter rather. And so it just, you said they were stick flying. I'm not sure. When I first looked at it, it looked like they were flight coupled and they just weren't paying attention. They were in the cockpit managing radios or something like that. That's the way it looked to me. It's really hard to say, but it doesn't look nefarious or anything like that. It looks like an accident to me.
Yeah. I think some of the low level routes that we utilize up around the New York area, I think for the to be an instrument route, it's a lot lower than I thought it was, but I think it's around 700 to 1,000 feet, and these guys, I think they were at 1,500 when they checked in, but the last reports from the ADSB feeds were around 200. And so,
hey, just for reference for the rest of us, because we literally have two subject matter experts in this space. How many hours do you have, Chris, and how many hours do you have, Jay?
So I've got just under 3,000 hours total, and that was a career worth of helicopter flying for me, with my last assignment being on the road as an investigator and not logging any stick time.
So I'm a crew chief, so it's slightly different, but I have 2,500 hours.
Okay.
Yeah. The V stands for visual.
Right.
So that's when you're hand flying and looking outside. But while you're talking about instruments, that's actually another thing that I got a little bit of clarification from, like I said, a friend who was formerly a member of that unit. The FAA issued a ruling. I don't know exactly, a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, regarding something called ADSB. And ADSB is, we've all heard of the transponder. We've all seen the airplane movies where it gets hijacked and they squawk 7,700 or 7,600, whatever it is for hijack. 7,700 is emergency, but at any rate, there's a new type of transponder that has a feature called ADSB, and it stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. And that's a mouthful, so good thing they made it an acronym. But essentially what it does is it communicates, it emits a signal that somehow communicates with the other aircraft in the airspace, and there's an algorithm that will give proximity alarms. And so the rule that the FAA made is, I think it's required that you have a transponder that sends a signal out for all aircraft and even drones now, as of meaning it was in effect last night. But you don't have to have the extra instrumentation that receives the signal in. And I know that sounds stupid, but when you're talking about aircraft avionics, there's a huge expense. And the FAA, when they do make a rule, they're always conscientious about, not putting a rule for expensive equipment that's going to put the small operators out of business or something like that. At any rate, with regard to the ADS-B on the Blackhawk, they would have had ADS-B out, which means they were broadcasting their position. There were a lot of reports that said, they weren't broadcasting, and that's not true, because when you look at the ATC video, you can see, their position and their call sign. And part of what ADS-B does is it transmits the information about the call sign to the air traffic controller. So they had them on radar, and in order for that to happen, they're not looking at, like a World War II blip on a screen. This is actually an encoded signal that is discreetly assigned to that particular aircraft with that call sign. It helps them understand where they are. So the confusion, I think, again, just a theory, is, when people say, oh, they weren't transmitting. No, what the helicopter didn't have is they didn't have the capability to receive the position that the jet was sending out. Now the jet, because they are FAA part, FAR part 130, 121, which is commercial air carrier, they're required to have out and in. There's a higher degree of safety requirement on commercial air travel because of the number of lives involved and the number of souls at stake. So they'll have the system that broadcasts out and in. But when you get to a certain altitude and you get close enough to the to the airfield, you're going to get a lot of bogus returns, because if you think about all the aircraft on that airport that were powered up and had transponder codes active, you're just going to get flooded with a ton of reports. So when you get into a scenario like that where you've kind of oversynthesized with too much, and you can easily dismiss and miss part of that you shouldn't. But back to the signal and the screen display from the air traffic controller station, you can see, and some of you may have seen this, but you can see the letters CA, Charlie Alpha, beginning to flash over each of the call signs of the aircraft that collided. And that either means collision alert or some type of proximity warning that the tower controller or the station controller, whoever is sitting there monitoring that screen, that's supposed to set off alarms in that workspace, whether that's the tower or there's a room behind the tower where they're monitoring those screens. And someone should have immediately, from air traffic control, started issuing collision avoidance guidance. Now that is part of the feature. If you have the ADS-B in, it will tell you climb, and it'll tell the other aircraft descend, or climb and turn right, or descend and turn left, whatever. It will automate that portion of it. But I think that my wife told me she saw a report today that said there was one tower operator who was covering two positions, and I don't have any more details on that, but I think that may have been what President Trump was referring to when he said, DEI is at play here, because there was another news report that said 100 air traffic controllers I don't know if they resigned or they had filed a formal grievance, but they were protesting DEI being advanced in the workplace, and that was displacing some of the more meritocracy entitled troops, meaning they deserve to be there, and not troops, but personnel were denied promotions in favor of the DEI. So this just kind of, I mean, it turns into a long dialogue, but you see all the elements at play that always, um, you always see this in a major accident like this, where there are all these little anomalies, things that shouldn't be there, that in some way or another contributed to this fatal outcome that we saw last night. And then the job of the investigator is, again, to collect all the information possible, interview as many people as possible, and then, you know, do a timeline and find out the why. And that's another part of the way we dissect an accident like this, is we don't just stop with the first. We keep going until it's painful. And one of the things that I used to say, conducting accident investigations in the military, is a lot of times we stop one why short of the root cause, especially when there are human factors involved. And that might be asking the uncomfortable question about, you know, the individual only got 4 hours of sleep the night before. The pilot only got 4 hours of sleep the night before. Well, why was that? Well, it's because, you know, he had a disagreement with his significant other, or, you know, he's late on his bills, or, you know, whatever. And so it's kind of, that's one area where the Army would kind of pull up short, is they wouldn't go too deep into the touchy-feely stuff. But, you know, the touchy-feely stuff is what, as human beings, I mean, you know, we live and exist inside our head, and that's such a huge part of what contributes to these accidents. At the end of the day, is, you know, we're limited as human beings. We make mistakes. We don't have eyes in the back of our head. You know, it's easy for us to become distracted, or all, you know, focused in on one thing, which, you know, after the fact is not the thing you should have been focused on. And it is very, very easy to Monday morning quarterback it, as we've seen. And that was a lot of, you know, I felt like I was swatting mosquitoes last night with all the people just insisting that this had to have been deliberate, because there's no way possible that this could have been an accident. But we see time and time again, it's the same types of errors that we make as humans that end up with these tragic results. A really simple theory, or a little analogy that I use to communicate this, and I just call it mousetraps. And so for me, level helicopter route that intersects a fixed wing final approach path is a mousetrap, meaning that a mousetrap, if left to its own devices, will eventually catch a mouse at some point in time. And yeah, I'm not trivializing what happened and the incredible loss of life last night, but, you know, from just looking at it from a systematic standpoint, you know, that's what you've got. You've got a mousetrap that your controls are, you know, maybe we've got one controller that works the east side of the airport, and another that works the west side. And if that wasn't present last night because they had one guy covering both sides, then you can easily see how you can become overcome by events. And all it takes, again, I'm not patting myself on the back here, but I was also an air traffic controller and air traffic controller instructor back in the day. But all it really takes is for one pilot to miss the call, or to misunderstand the instructions, or to not act according to the instructions that they were given, to put you as the air traffic behind the power curve, we say. And that just means now you got to catch up. It's kind of like the Lucy and Ethel thing, where they're trying to stuff the chocolates in the boxes and they end up shoving them in their mouth. That's what commercial aviation is like for an air traffic controller. When you're on shift, you are sequencing those aircraft, and it's like keeping plates spinning, and all it takes is for one of those plates to drop, and you got to go give it more attention than the others. And then you can see how that type of scenario would spiral out of hand pretty quickly. And that could have been something that was happening with regard to manpower, and again, something that President Trump was trying to establish in his address to the nation today. So, other questions?
Okay, I got one, and it's just because, remember, I'm a passenger. I have no idea about this stuff. Okay, but if you have an area where two planes possibly can cross, don't you think there should be like warnings especially when there one's a helicopter that can just sit there, like like a traffic kind of stop sign kind of thing. That you're like, hey, in 10 minutes, a plane's gonna cross your area, cross your path. Does it not work that way? Do they not have like a pre-written path that they have to go on?
Yeah, so in aviation, what they do is, because you've got three dimensions to deal with, so you can separate aircraft by altitude, and you can separate them by time. And so that's what you typically, time is what air traffic control typically relies on, because one aircraft, off the runway while they're clearing another one to come in and land. And so it is a very well-oiled juggling act. And when you think of it in terms like that, then you can start to understand why two aircraft ended up at the same place at the same time, because they were both, the Blackhawk was cleared to transit through the area. The American Airlines aircraft was cleared to land on runway 33, and again, situational awareness, and here's it's a little bit of a diabolical element when you look at it. And I talked about this today with a group of pilots, and I said, it's not enough just to understand what your clearance is and to know where you are. You also need to have that situational awareness, Andy, and that's what your friend was referring to again and again. And Jay, you mentioned it as well, is that, you also need to understand the clearances of the aircraft for occupying that airspace with you. And so we hear a lot about congested airspace, but all it takes, again, like I mentioned, is, for one pilot to screw it up, and now it becomes contested airspace. And that's what happened last night. The sequencing didn't work out. I think that, if, again, going under the assumption that it was an orientation flight, then you had one pilot in the helicopter instructing, the other helicopter pilot learning. If you had that on top of everything else, then you've thrown one too many balls to the juggler, and they're not going to be able to keep them all in the air. And because of that, as that aircraft turns, the jet turns to final, it's just absolutely on top of them in a hurry. And I just, in my mind, that's kind of the way I'm envisioning this. And as I mentioned earlier, you take the information, the anomalies, you separate the truths from the fiction, the contributing anomalies to those that are just circumstantial, and then you put them in a timeline, and that will literally tell you the story like a breadcrumb trail of exactly what happened. And so, since I have all of the information, you do put together a working theory, knowing, and like I said, like an episode of House, it's only as good as you're able to confirm with the facts as they are put in the proper sequence, and they tell you the story.
Well, here's the thing that I don't understand, because so like if you look at the bubble, Cobb put up that area, that the altitude limit for that segment of the VFR, I don't know what that is, route, was 200 feet AGL.
Yeah.
So what I mean is there's a runway there, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, logically, you would say, hey, I'm gonna merge. You know what I mean? Or let the plane. The plane has right of way, right? I would assume,
Yeah.
because a plane can't just stop there and a helicopter can.
Yes, you're exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is what I'm saying. So I would assume, as a helicopter pilot, even if the people are like, hey, you would still be like, hey, man, I'm gonna approach this with caution. No, I mean, am I like talking out of my butt here?
No, it's not. So it's, again.
So that one little section. I mean, you have the entire other area, but I'm like, that one section where the planes normally land, you'd be like, okay, let me make sure that I'm not on autopilot. I have maximum situational awareness, right? And I'm assuming if it's a Blackhawk, it's got to have some kind of radar, right? I mean, my freaking car would take, breaks if there's somebody in front of it, right? So I don't know.
Yeah. So um, when you get clear, when you're so remember the game we used to play as kids, shark in the pool, and you know
The
that's what
shark in the pool?
yeah, that's like you know somebody's a shark and you got to swim
Oh,
away, but you're in a pool and you can only go so far. Then it's kind of like that when you're a helicopter. When you're a helicopter moving through big Class Bravo airspace, which is what you see around Reagan National, and that means lots of commercial jet activity. You're the bait. You're the bait fish, and everybody else is a shark because they're bigger than you, they're faster than you, and you got to get out of their way. And so if you're cleared through, the goal as a helicopter pilot, the goal is to get through and get out of everybody's way as quickly as possible. And you're relying on ATC for the sequencing because just like they have air traffic control procedures have narrowed or refined this process to the point that one aircraft can be cleared to take off, the other aircraft can be cleared to land. It's the same stretch of asphalt, and as long as everything goes right, the aircraft taking off doesn't have an aborted takeoff or hit birds or run off the runway, then no problem. And what they're doing safeguards after that. If that were to happen, the approaching aircraft, the one that's coming into land, would be told to go around. But you do see situations where two aircraft have a right to that same piece of space in the point space in the sky or same stretch of asphalt at the same time, meaning they have clearances at the same time. The air traffic controller knows because of timing they won't be occupying the same point on that runway at the same time.
Let me interrupt you 1 second here.
Sure.
On the news, they're saying that 24 hours before that crash, a plane had to abort its landing because a helicopter got in the way. Also.
Yeah, and you know what? That's so. Again, I mean, that kind of fits right into what we're talking about with regard to sequencing, and now if you've got two events, the one the day before, that's a near miss. It doesn't matter necessarily that they came within X number of feet with one another with regard to procedural operations. That would be considered a near miss, and that's something that should have been to the helicopter company, or if it was the military, they should have debriefed that, and countermeasures should have been put in place for that. If it was procedural with regard to the FAA, they should have briefed it and they should have put some controls in place. So now that's what that report does, is that starts to make you say, okay, is this a systemic issue? One event is not, but two is starting to look like it's a systemic problem. Hey, man.
You may have said this earlier and I missed it. On the air traffic controller screens, I'm sure there's some kind of signature that says whether the aircraft is in autopilot. What are the chances that they were both in autopilot and they were just complacent?
So, not to contradict Jay, but you wouldn't be on autopilot at 200 feet. You've got too many obstacles down that low. So before you would.
But could you be?
I mean, you could be. Yeah, I don't think there's anything that would physically prevent you from putting on autopilot. But
can planes land on autopilot?
Some can, and I feel certain that I've been on some that when the plane hit the tarmac, it woke the pilots up too. But typically that's reserved for really, really bad weather operations, and the pilots are monitoring the process as they come in. So again,
I'll be right back.
that's a well, to answer his question, that's a again, the purpose of an instrument approach is to get you within range of the airport so that you can make out the visual. Um, and if it's nights or bad weather, it's you're trying to make runway environment is what they call it, but there are very high intensity lights that will show you what the show you where you are with regards to the runway and that sort of thing, and so that's the point of the instrument approach, not necessarily to land you. And once a pilot proceeds visually, what they typically do is they cancel their instrument landing clearance. And I would say, just from a procedural standpoint, a lot of times that's when they disconnect the autopilot as well, and they proceed visually, and they're hand flying at that point. So
So you're not involved in this at all, but if you were, where would you start?
yeah, so I mean, ironically, there's so much good information already floating around social media. I want to backtrack, and I'd go back to the air traffic control facility, and you start pulling tapes and transcripts and preserving the weather data. There are things that are perishable that you really need to get at firsthand. And another example is eyewitnesses. You want to get to them as soon as possible, and start collecting any information that they can add. So the other, whoever the pilot was that says, Tower, did you see that? I'd want to find out who that was, interview them, and have them talk me through it. You start looking for the black boxes. You're going to have a cockpit voice recorder inside the jet aircraft, and then you're going to have a different type of recording device inside the Blackhawk. I don't know for sure that because this is a much more advanced model of Blackhawk than they had when I retired back in 2011. So I don't know if they've got voice recording capability, but I do know that they have the capability to record parameters. And there was uh, within the Army Safety Center, there was a laboratory where we could take, just a burned up chunk of a recorder down to the lab, and they'd pull it apart and hook jumpers up, and what you would get out of that is an Excel spreadsheet that was about 15 yards long with all the parameters. And then you can start to see things like altitude, airspeed, heading, engine performance. That would tell you if any last minute changes were made prior to the impact. Um, and that would tell you, hey, they did see them, but it was too late. Or you could see something that says, no, they never made any control inputs until the collision. Therefore, we assume by extension that they were never aware of the other aircraft um, proximity to their own. So there are things like that you want to get a hold of. You start to put together your board, which is also a very important aspect of it. So you're going to bring in someone who's a CRJ 701 pilot or whatever that variant was, and that's going to be your subject matter expert for that aircraft. You would bring in a Blackhawk pilot. You would take as many of the components as you're able to fish out of the river and send it to be bench tested, torn down and bench tested, and they're going to give you a report that says, engines were producing full power, all the way up to impact, and um, you're going to get autopsy results. They're going to give you toxicology information that will, you know, just a lot of times exonerates the pilots to make sure that they weren't under the influence of anything that could, slow down their critical decision thinking or pilot decision making capabilities. And so you're going to get toxicology results, and then you start working on your timeline, and just putting together the list of what happened and when, and try to spread that net as wide as you possibly can. collect as much data as you can surrounding the event, and then go back whatever they determine an appropriate amount of time is. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, 30 days for the airline. You're going to look and see if there are any operational changes or publication updates. You're going to see if there is anything procedurally that could have been done that wasn't done.
Thank you so much for doing this, Chris.
Yeah, of course.
This is like really, you're really the perfect person to host a space right now. I wish more people would have come in. I mean, you know everything about this whole thing. You're a helicopter pilot. You investigate accidents. You investigate these kind of accidents. You've worked in air traffic control. I mean, this is like this is great. I'm surprised Fox News hasn't asked you to do a segment.
Nobody knows who I am.
Well, that's too bad, because you just explained a lot to everybody. And I just wanted to add, a lot of people were exactly what you said, saying, oh, this is intentional, it's a conspiracy, it was terrorism. Well, you got to remember, we haven't been in the cockpit of these things. So for us to watch that little 15-30 second video where it looked like, from all we could tell, and it just looked like the helicopter intentionally crashed into the airplane. And I can understand how you and Jay and anybody else that's a pilot looked at that and said, well, no, that's not exactly how it worked. First of all, we don't even know what altitude they were, the approach, anything else. I had watched something earlier today where a pilot was on the news talking about it, and he was saying that the plane was higher than the helicopter. And I think he said the helicopter was kind of coming in from behind the plane, and the plane was coming down, and they knew it. I mean, there's a flight path for these planes landing, but the last transmission to the helicopter pilot, and like you said, they were on two different frequencies, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But the plane's coming down. Well, the helicopter thought he was clear. The plane didn't see the helicopter because he was above it. And like I was saying before, you don't see below you. You barely see above the dashboard in those planes. Yeah. So the helicopter just came up underneath it, and that's when they hit. And for someone that knows nothing about that, like 99.9% of the people on X, it looked intentional. And I may have I'm guilty myself. I may have said it on a post, responded to somebody saying, yeah, I agree, it looked intentional. I hope it's not, intentional or a terrorist thing. But thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that people didn't get from my responses last night is, how can you know? How can you know this is an accident? Well, it's like doctors who all they do day in and day out is diagnose cancer. They know it when they see it. And again, just all the markers were present. Let me get Jason Cohen. I just approved you. I think you had something you wanted to contribute. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, hey, Chris. I just jumped on here and saw this. I'm a 20-year crew chief with 4,000 plus hours. I was a contractor after this, so I've flown in multiple busy airspaces, Dubai, New York City, never flown in DC, but I know what it's like flying at night in a busy airspace like that. And I've watched some videos on YouTube, and I saw that the CRJ was descending from 400 into 300 feet, and then down to 200, I think, is when they collided.
Right.
And you could see the altitude of the UH-62. One thing that was a mic model. I'm 90% sure, and they do have recorders in the aircraft too. But one question I had, typically in flying in busier airspaces like this, when Tower gives them clearance, I suppose they were going to be crossing the center line. Tower gave them clearance to follow or to pass behind the CRJ, and he even acknowledged that. But typically when they call out traffic, they give a clock and an altitude of the traffic so you can positively identify it. And I didn't hear it in that radio traffic.
I agree with you. I didn't hear it either, and that's one of the things that I was thinking through last night is, you know, what could they have done better, and they could have been more descriptive. And you know, we talk about that a lot as part of our crew resource management. Be very specific, give clock positions, altitudes, and
Yeah.
some of the pilots I talked to today, I said, you know, how many times have you been asked that same question from tower? Hey, have you got the traffic? You know, it's a whatever it is at whatever distance, and altitude, and I agree. I didn't hear that last night. So, but I did talk to a friend who said something today that made a lot of sense to me. Is when if you look in the route of flight where each of those aircraft were when tower is giving Pat 25 the instructions to pass behind, they were both, you know, over the Potomac at that time. If you just thought of the Potomac as a 2-lane highway, you know, I think that the Army crew could have easily, you know, thought they were going to do rules of the road, and when they said pass behind them, I think that in their mind they could have mistaken that to mean I'm going to pass, you know, right side to right side, rules of the road, so to speak, and then I will pass behind him at that point. The other thing that was not mentioned was that, you know, the aircraft is, it will be turning to final. And so that's another important little word. If they had said, you know, final, I think that just that little bit of clarification could have done a lot to you know, jog them into going,
I got it muted.
3-3 final. We're right in the middle of it.
I already talked.
And that could have been part of it. But yeah, that's a good observation. What branch of service were you in?
I was Army.
Nice.
The another thing that I want to mention is minimal crew requirements as well. There were only 3 crew members in that aircraft that night, 2 pilots and the crew chief. Typically in a Blackhawk, when you're a single crew chief, you're going to sit on the right side because that's the side the tail rotor's on. As tragic as this was, I do believe had there been another crew chief on the left side to pick up that scan sector, this accident could have been avoided. And I hate that, but it brings up the point that maybe the minimal crew requirements may be looked at in the SOP there, especially in busy airspace at nighttime. But I hope that gets avoided next time. And
did you have different crew member requirements for combat versus, you know, peacetime?
Yeah, combat, yes. But peacetime in the U.S., we could fly single crew chief, aided or unaided at night, as long as we weren't multi-ship. Once we were multi-ship, as long as you weren't the trail aircraft, you could have 2 crew chiefs, or you could have 1 crew chief.
Yeah.
Or you could have 1 crew chief in the trail aircraft, but if you had aircraft behind you, you had to have both crew chiefs.
I got you. Yeah. So, you know, one of the things that, and again, this is just speculation, not this accident, but I've seen it in the past where, you know, it's the kind of flight, it's not sexy. Nobody's really, you know, jumping up and down to go ride along on a local area orientation flight. And so, you know, that can play into, you know, how many people they put aboard versus, you know, something that's got some kind of real world implication, or you're flying a VIP and, you know, you want to look your best and make a contribution, represent, you know, whatever it is you do. And so, you know, that's another big question that we, you know, need to find the answer to is what exactly was the mission that the Blackhawk was performing. We talked a little earlier in the space tonight about, you know, in the Army, we're either training or we're fighting, and we don't fight stateside, so it's all training. And a lot of people took umbrage with hearing that this was a training flight. But I mean, it's a core function of what this type of unit, a VIP transport unit, would do. And this is the airspace. This is your local area of operations. So it makes perfect sense why this type of training would be core to the function of the unit, and it would make sense why they were conducting it. So Jay Hans was on earlier, and he mentioned something about, I think they call these aircraft gold tops. You mentioned that it's a Mike model, and for those who don't know, most military will have a series of aircraft. The very first one will be the A model, and then it goes B, C, D, and we use a phonetic alphabet. And so this was the M model, and that's how many variations the Blackhawk has undergone since it entered service, late 70s, early 80s, long time ago. And so Mike model, tell me, Jason, is that the most current model? Is that what the task force guys are using, or do they have something even newer?
Yeah, most of the regular Army and the task force is using Mike models now. Most of the regular Army it went Alpha model, Lima, and then now we're on the Mike model.
Okay.
I mean, beside the technical upgrades aren't necessarily that significant. This one's pretty significant because it's got the digital cockpit and some fly-by-wire and some improvements, engine improvements and exhaust improvements, things like that, rotor blade improvements. But the biggest thing is we have the digital voice recorders and the box, so we'll get all the data. We'll be able to hear the internal communication system inside the aircraft as well.
Yeah, and so for somebody that's done this mission a lot more recently and around, busy airspace, tell the folks what it's like flying goggles through an area like that.
Yeah, it's especially in a city, and as much as you've been flying too, that it's really easy to confuse ground lights with aircraft or aircraft with ground lights, or especially when at lower altitude, when sometimes you've got buildings higher than when you're flying too. So it is very easy, and it always flying, you do have to keep your head on a swivel, and you have to understand scanning techniques to be able to identify aircraft or obstacles that could pose a threat to the flight. So I can see how easy it would have been to maybe that a landing light is really bright, especially 10 o'clock, right? But yeah, I wasn't in the aircraft, and it's hard to tell. So,
well, I think Hollywood hasn't done us any favors. Goggles, they don't make any sound when you power them on. That's all added in after the fact, and you can't just magically see everything. What night vision goggles do is they amplify light sources, and when I first joined the Army, we had surgical tubing that held these things on your face. And as an 18-year-old kid, I was going through a course called the Air Scout Observer course. That was my enlisted job, and it was the most foreign feeling in the world. You felt like a deer with a head full of antlers when you first put these things on, and you have about a 40-degree field of view. Maybe it's a little better now, but 40 degrees was pretty much what the number that we used throughout my career. And the way you compensate for that is you have to scan. You have to constantly move your head and take in as much as you can, and that is a discipline that you have to learn. If you just stare in one direction or straight ahead, everything beyond 40 degrees, from the front of those tubes is going to be in your blind spot. So you do have tremendous blind spots as a result of using night vision goggles. And then there's been some back and forth with some of the other folks I've talked to today about whether they would have had the goggles up or down. And at the end of the day, that's a crew decision. I know when I worked for Air Medical Company, if one crew member had the goggles down, they all put them down. And the reason for that is so that everybody is they're able to have the same sight picture and communicate, speaking the same language, so to speak. Whereas if you're flying with them flipped up, because it is so brightly lit, around metropolitan areas. But typically, you wouldn't do that if you get down around 200 feet. You know, you got cell antennas, you've got all kinds of little things that can jump up and grab you when you get that low, and I think instinctively, you know, if you have goggles at your disposal, you just flip them down. Yeah, that's going to give you a much better view of what's out there. But to compensate for that, you do have to scan. You have to move your head. And if again, I keep stressing this, if this was a local air orientation flight, you've got one instructor pilot who is providing instruction. You've got another pilot who is receiving that instruction, and they're pretty much going to be taking the cue from wherever that instructor pilot is directing their attention at that particular point in time. So you could absolutely have a scenario where something as big as a regional jet just appeared out of nowhere and runs you over, and that's essentially, you know, what happened here. It's honestly not important as to who hit who. What the questions they're going to want to try to answer from an investigation standpoint is how come no one reacted or took evasive action, and how come neither of the pilots saw the other aircraft? And that's really where they're going to want to dig in and start looking for causation.
Yeah, from what I understand, they were doing an APART. If you don't know what an APART is, for anyone listening, that's an annual flight proficiency test that all crew members do once a year to make sure that you're maintaining proficiency in the aircraft.
Yeah, and so earlier, Andy, I believe it was Andy, stated that there's a report now saying that one pilot had 1,000 hours and the other had 500 hours. And that, to me, seems a little low for a VIP unit, but perhaps not. Jason, were you ever in a VIP unit?
I was back in 2000, 2001 in South Korea.
Okay. I've got a friend who flew presidential helicopters back during the Bush days, and I don't think that, you know, for them it's another assignment. You know, you just kind of, you get assigned to a VIP unit, and you know, whether you're a frontline combat unit or a VIP unit, he was Marines, but I mean, you're going to have pilots of all skill levels and at different points of their careers, different ranks and things like that. You know, the Army is always, you know, replacing or replenishing itself, and so you're always going to have, you know, either moving up the scale or, you know, higher up in the scale that's going to be teaching you. And scale, I'm talking about flight hours, accumulation and experience. And so, you know, that in and of itself is not that unusual. I just didn't understand, because I don't have familiarization with it, you know, what the requirements are to fly VIPs in this particular unit. And, you know, 500 hours seemed a little low, but, you know, like I said, you would certainly have that in a combat unit as well.
Yeah, I do want a small request. Obviously, our thoughts and prayers go out to all the family members of this accident, but I do want to think about the family of the IP or the pilot in command of that aircraft too, and their family, and what they're going to be going through here in the next couple of months too. That's, as a spouse, I can't imagine that storm that they're going to have to work their way through. But yeah, my prayers do go out to the family members.
Yeah, I completely agree. I appreciate you bringing that up, and that's one of the things that I was advocating for last night, was to have empathy and remember all of the lives that were impacted in this. And I'll tell you that for me, as a person, just, you know, a personal trait of mine is I'm pretty high in empathy. You know, that loss it's tragic, it's immediate, it's drastic. Nothing prepares you for it. You know, regardless of how many times, you know, you've thought in the back of your mind. I'm speaking as a spouse would now. no matter how many times you said, you know, it's a possibility, you never prepare yourself emotionally for this eventuality, and it is absolutely disastrous. And you're right, the trauma that occurs from such a tragic and immediate loss like this is just hard to believe. And I promise you that the people on board that plane last night, they were thinking, you know, what you and I are thinking, you know, put everything away, get my bag ready to go, so that as soon as they pull up to the gate, you know, I can be out of this tube, and on my way, they're already thinking about what they're gonna do, you know, last night, get to the hotel or grab something to eat, or you know, phone home or whatever, and that's you know, I think that's common throughout all the military services, you know, whether it's you know, a Navy ship, a submarine, or an aircraft, or a tank, or a soldier on a battlefield somewhere. You know, just that immediate loss is something that's just absolutely impossible to prepare yourself for, and very, very difficult to move past. So I thank you for bringing the humanity back into the discussion tonight, and reminding us of that. But I think
Hey, Jason.
most of the folks in this group.
Yes, sir.
Jason, if you or anyone else in the group wants to say a prayer, feel free.
Oh yeah, I'd love to. Hold on, let me let me gather my thoughts here. I wasn't anticipating this, but yeah. Lord Father, we just we pray for your mercy and your grace. We pray for all the families of this tragic accident. We pray that that you comfort the heavy hearts tonight. We continue to pray for your safety among all of our aviators across the U.S. and pray for our country and healing. Pray that you lead us in the right direction and in healing after this. And in your name we pray, Father. Amen.
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 But, wasn't expecting to pray in public, but yeah,
No,
thanks for allowing me to speak, and yeah, enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Let me just interrupt and just tell that you two are badasses. Like, it's, you know, coming from somebody that has no idea about any of that stuff, you guys are mind-blowingly incredible. So I just wanted to say thank you, because you guys really do a lot for this country and for this, you know, let alone this space. So
Amen.
I appreciate you guys. And Jason, I just followed you.
Oh, not very active on Twitter, but yeah, thank you guys, and yeah, you guys have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Jason. And by the way, folks, that's what moral courage looks like when you pop into a space and somebody says, "Hey, if you want to lift up a prayer to God, go right ahead." And then you know, you step up and you knock it out of the park. So well done, and thank
Thanks
you
a
for
lot.
that. That's very cool. That's a great note to end on, but I did want to just offer one more time, if anybody has any questions. We kind of talked through the whole thing, and if you came in at different points and didn't get your question asked, then send me a request here, and then you know, we'll get your questions answered.